Good evening and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift towards something that has hung above human beings for as long as we have looked up. The moon. Not the idea of it, not a picture of it, but the actual gray world that crossed the dark sky tonight and will cross it again tomorrow, patient and unhurried, almost 239,000 miles away. It is such a familiar companion that we rarely stop to think about it. It rises behind rooftops and trees. It pulls quietly on the oceans. It changes shape across the month. Full one night and a thin crescent another, as though slowly turning its face. Children draw it. Sailors once steered by it. Lovers walk beneath it. And every now and then on a clear evening you may have looked up and felt, without quite saying so, that the moon was looking back. For nearly all of human history, that is where the relationship ended. The moon could be seen, sung about, mapped from afar, even studied through telescopes. But it could not be reached. It belonged to the heavens, and the heavens were not a place people went. Then, within the span of a single human lifetime, that ancient distance was crossed. Not in legend, not in dream, but in fact. 3 men climbed into a small craft on the coast of Florida, rose on a tower of fire, sailed for 4 days through the dark between worlds, and stepped onto the surface of the moon. Their footprints are still there. No wind has touched them. No rain has fallen on them. They wait, undisturbed in dust older than the earth itself. That journey is what we will follow tonight. We will move slowly. There is no need to hurry. We will begin long before the rocket was built, long before the astronauts were born, in the centuries when reaching the moon was only a quiet wish. We will pass through the years of careful engineering, the rivalry that pushed it forward, the patient practice in lower orbits, and the morning when the largest machine ever flown lifted 3 small lives toward another world. We will travel with them through the long coast, hear the strange alarms that nearly stopped the landing, and stand with them in the gray stillness of the Sea of Tranquility. We will also remember the 3rd astronaut, the one who did not walk on the moon, who waited alone in lunar orbit while the other 2 went down. His story is quieter and worth telling. If these slow journeys help you rest, you can follow SleepWise and share it with someone who might enjoy falling asleep while learning something new. For tonight, settle in. Let the room grow soft. Let your shoulders ease into the pillow. The moon is still above you, exactly where it has always been, drifting slowly across the night as it has for billions of years. And the long story of how we reached it begins, as so many great stories do, with a dream that for a very long time seemed impossible. The wish to reach the moon is older than anyone can quite say. Long before there were rockets or engines, long before there were even reliable telescopes, people gazed upward and tried to imagine what it would mean to go there. The moon was the brightest thing in the night sky, the closest of all the heavenly bodies, and yet it remained completely beyond reach. That tension of being so visible and so unreachable gave it a particular hold on the human imagination. In the 2nd century, a Greek writer named Lucian of Samosata composed one of the earliest known stories of a voyage to the moon. In his tale, a ship is lifted by a great waterspout into the sky, where its crew meets the inhabitants of the lunar world. It was satire more than science, but the moon had become a place in literature, a destination for stories centuries before anyone could reach it, in fact. The dream continued through the centuries. In the early 17th century, the astronomer Johannes Kepler, who had helped uncover the laws of planetary motion, wrote a short work called Somnium, or The Dream. It described a journey to the moon and tried in its own way to imagine what the lunar surface might actually be like. Kepler had no rocket and no spacecraft to offer. He had only his calculations, his telescope, and his careful curiosity. But he was beginning to treat the moon not as a symbol, but as a world. By the 19th century, the idea had passed from astronomers into popular storytelling. In 1865, the French writer Jules Verne published From the Earth to the Moon, in which a great cannon launched a manned capsule from Florida toward the lunar surface. The science was imperfect. No human being could survive the acceleration of such a cannon. But Verne understood something the world had not yet quite grasped. To reach the moon, you would need an enormous launching device, an enormous supply of energy, and a small craft at the top carrying the travelers. The basic shape of the answer was already forming in fiction. H.G. Wells, the English writer, took up the dream a few decades later in The First Men in the Moon. He imagined a strange substance that could shield a spacecraft from gravity. That was not how it would actually be done, but the longing was the same. The moon was becoming a place that could, in principle, be visited. What none of these writers had was a workable engine. The real bridge between dream and possibility would come not from storytellers, but from a small group of patient, eccentric pioneers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They would discover, slowly and against great skepticism, that a different kind of motion entirely might one day carry human beings beyond the earth. Their work begins quietly in 3 different countries, with 3 thoughtful men who had each, in their own way, fallen in love with the sky. The first of those pioneers was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a deaf Russian schoolteacher working in a small town south of Moscow. In the 1890s and into the early 1900s, he sat in modest rooms and worked out, with nothing but pencil and paper, the basic mathematics of space flight. He understood that a rocket would have to carry both its fuel and the means to burn it, that liquid propellants would likely outperform solid ones, and that reaching orbit would require staging in which used portions of the rocket fell away as it climbed. He published these ideas largely in obscurity. Few people read them, but the foundation was being laid. In the United States, a physicist named Robert Goddard reached similar conclusions through experiment. In 1926, on a quiet farm in Massachusetts, he launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. It rose only 41 feet into the air and flew for 2.5 seconds. By modern standards, it was almost nothing. But it was the first time a rocket of that kind had ever flown, and Goddard understood what he had just begun. In Germany, a young engineer named Hermann Oberth was writing books about the possibility of space travel that would inspire an entire generation. Among the young people he influenced was a teenager named Werner von Braun, who would one day play an enormous part in the journey to the moon, though by a long and complicated road that passed through war. The Second World War accelerated rocketry in ways no peaceful era could have. In Germany, von Braun and his team developed the V-2, the first long-range guided ballistic missile used as a weapon against European cities. It was a terrible chapter, and it cannot be separated from the deaths it caused. When the war ended, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought out German rocket engineers and brought them home. Von Braun and many of his colleagues came to America. Other scientists went east. The same expertise that had built weapons would soon be turned toward the sky. Then came the rivalry. By the mid-1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union had emerged from the war as the two great powers of the world, and their relationship had cooled into something tense and watchful. It was called the Cold War. There were no open battles between them, but there was a quiet, continuous competition in science, in weapons, and increasingly in space. On the 4th of October, 1957, the Soviet Union launched a small metal sphere called Sputnik into orbit around the Earth. It was about the size of a beach ball, and it carried a simple radio transmitter that beeped steadily as it passed overhead. To many Americans, that steady beeping was a shock. A foreign power had reached space first. What followed was not yet a race to the moon, but it was the beginning of one. In the years that followed Sputnik, the pace of events quickened. In 1958, the United States established a new civilian agency to lead its space efforts, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, soon known simply as NASA. Its task was clear, even if the path was not. America wanted to catch up, and then to lead, but the Soviet Union was still ahead. On the 12th of April, 1961, a young Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to leave the Earth. His small spherical capsule, called Vostok 1, completed a single orbit around the planet in less than 2 hours and brought him safely home. He was 27 years old. To much of the world, he became an instant figure of wonder. To the Americans, his flight was another stinging signal that they were not yet first. Less than 6 weeks later, on the 25th of May, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and made one of the boldest commitments in the history of any government. He declared that the United States should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was out. He did not say it would be easy. He said it would be hard and that the country should do it precisely because it was hard. The clock had begun. The American crewed program had to be built from almost nothing. It came in stages, each one carefully designed to teach the next. The first was Project Mercury, which sent a single astronaut at a time into space in a small one-person capsule. Alan Shepard became the first American in space in 1961 on a brief suborbital flight. John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962, circling the planet 3 times. The Mercury flights showed that people could survive launch, weightlessness, and re-entry. Then came Project Gemini, a more ambitious program with 2-person capsules and longer missions. Gemini was where the harder skills were learned. Astronauts practiced rendezvous, the careful art of bringing 2 spacecraft together in orbit. They practiced docking, in which one craft physically joined another. They practiced spacewalks, learning how to leave the capsule and move in the strange vacuum outside. They learned to live in space for days at a time. None of this was glamorous in the way the moon landing would later seem. It was patient, technical, sometimes nearly invisible to the public. But every skill the Mercury and Gemini astronauts developed would later be needed by the men who went to the moon. Without rendezvous, there could be no lunar mission. Without long-duration flight, there could be no 4-day voyage. By 1966, Gemini had ended. The patient apprenticeship was almost complete. Apollo was waiting. Apollo was meant to be the final step. Its purpose was clear from the start. It would carry astronauts to the moon and bring them safely home. The spacecraft would be larger and more complex than anything that had come before. It would consist of 2 main parts: the command module, where the crew lived during most of the journey, and the lunar module, a separate craft designed only to descend to the lunar surface and return to lunar orbit. The work was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people across the United States contributed to it, in factories, in laboratories, in tracking stations, in offices, in machine shops. The astronauts themselves were only the visible tip of an extraordinary effort. Behind every flight stood engineers, mathematicians, technicians, seamstresses sewing spacesuits by hand, and quiet rooms full of people doing calculations that had never been done before. By early 1967, the first crewed Apollo mission was nearly ready. Its 3 astronauts were Virgil Grissom, known as Gus, an experienced pilot who had flown in both Mercury and Gemini; Edward White, who had become the first American to walk in space; and Roger Chaffee, a younger astronaut preparing for his first flight. They were to test the new command module in Earth orbit, the first step toward the moon. On the evening of the 27th of January, 1967, the 3 men were sealed inside the capsule for a ground test on the launch pad. The rocket beneath them was unfueled. The test was meant to be routine, a rehearsal of the launch sequence with the spacecraft on internal power. The crew had been in their suits for hours. There were small frustrations, a smell in the air, communication problems, a mood of tired patience. Then, without warning, A fire broke out inside the cabin. The pure oxygen atmosphere used in the spacecraft at that time allowed the flames to spread with terrible speed. The hatch could not be opened quickly from inside. Within moments, all three astronauts were gone. The country mourned. The agency mourned. The question hung in the air, plain and painful. Could the program continue at all? Some thought it could not. But after a long and unflinching investigation, the engineers and astronauts together chose to go on. The command module was redesigned. The hatch was changed so that it could be opened outward quickly. The cabin atmosphere was modified. Materials were replaced. The astronauts themselves insisted that the work continue, that the deaths of their friends would only make sense if the mission was completed. It was not triumphal failure, but endurance. Apollo went forward more carefully than before, carrying with it the memory of three men who had not lived to see what came next. The path to the moon had grown quieter, but it had not closed. While the redesigned command module took shape, another part of the program was rising in the Alabama heat. To reach the moon, an enormous rocket would be needed, far larger than anything the world had ever built. That rocket was the Saturn V, and its construction was one of the great engineering efforts of the 20th century. The team behind it was led by Wernher von Braun, the German engineer who had come to the United States after the war and now worked at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Around him gathered hundreds of engineers, machinists, and designers, many of them young, many of them learning as they went. They were building something for which there was no real precedent. The Saturn V stood 363 feet tall on the launch pad. That is taller than the Statue of Liberty, taller than most cathedrals, taller than nearly any structure that has ever lifted itself off the ground. Fully fueled, it weighed more than 6 million pounds. Most of that weight was simply propellant, the kerosene and liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen that would burn in its engines. At the base of the rocket sat the first stage, called the SIC. Its 5 enormous F1 engines were the heart of the machine. Each one produced about 1.5 million pounds of thrust. Together, the 5 generated thrust equivalent to roughly 7.5 million pounds, the most powerful rocket engines ever flown. When they ignited, they would burn through 20 tons of fuel each second. The first stage alone would lift the rocket only about 40 miles into the sky in 2.5 minutes before falling away into the Atlantic. Above it stood the second stage, the SR2, with 5 smaller engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Above that, the third stage, the SIVB, with a single engine that could be restarted in space. Each stage was a rocket in its own right, designed to fire, exhaust itself, and separate cleanly before the next took over. Only the small spacecraft at the very top would actually reach the moon. The Saturn V was tested in stages, slowly and with great care, after the Apollo 1 fire. The first complete flight, an uncrewed mission called Apollo 4, took place in November of 1967. When the engines ignited, the ground shook for miles. Reporters watching from the press site found that the sound was almost physical, pressing against their chests, rattling their cameras. Walter Cronkite's broadcast booth trembled on its foundations. It worked. The Saturn V rose, stage by stage, and performed exactly as it had been designed to do. 2 further uncrewed tests followed, and then in December of 1968, Apollo 8 carried 3 astronauts all the way to the moon and back, orbiting it 10 times before returning home. The path through the sky was open. Now the question was, who would ride it? By early 1969, after several successful Apollo flights had tested the spacecraft in Earth orbit and around the moon itself, NASA was ready to choose the crew that would attempt the landing. The mission would be called Apollo 11, and its 3 astronauts had been selected from a small group of experienced test pilots, each carrying his own quiet history. The commander was Neil Armstrong, born on a farm in Ohio in 1930. He had flown combat missions in the Korean War as a young naval aviator, then become a civilian test pilot, flying the X-15 rocket plane to the edge of space at speeds above 4,000 miles per hour. He was known among his colleagues as exceptionally calm, even by the standards of test pilots. He spoke little. He did not seek attention. When the engines of an experimental aircraft failed beneath him, he had a way of working the problem all the way to the ground without his voice rising. That steadiness was one of the reasons he had been chosen. The lunar module pilot was Edwin Aldrin, known to everyone as Buzz. He had been born in New Jersey in 1930, the same year as Armstrong. He had also flown combat in Korea, then earned a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where his thesis had been on orbital rendezvous, the very skill that would be needed to bring the lunar module back to the command module after the landing. He was bright, intense, and direct, with a deep technical understanding of the spacecraft he would help fly. The command module pilot was Michael Collins, born in 1930 in Rome, where his father, an American general, had been stationed. He had become an Air Force test pilot, then an astronaut, and had already flown once in space on Gemini 10. He was thoughtful, observant, given to writing carefully about what he saw. On Apollo 11, he would not walk on the moon. He would remain in orbit aboard the command module while Armstrong and Aldrin descended. It was a role that asked for discipline and a particular kind of patience. The 3 men trained together for months, though they did not become close friends in the way some crews did. Armstrong was reserved by nature. Aldrin was driven and somewhat private. Collins was the most outwardly companionable of the 3. They respected one another, worked together with great care, and accepted that the mission asked of them what it asked. They practiced endlessly in simulators, running through every imaginable failure. They studied the lunar surface in photographs taken by the earlier Apollo missions. They walked through the spacecraft in factories, knowing every switch and dial. They prepared for the chance that things would go wrong. By the early summer of 1969, They were as ready as careful preparation could make them. The launch date was set for the 16th of July. The countdown was beginning. In the final weeks before the flight, the three astronauts entered a quiet period of preparation that was both meticulous and strange. They were placed in a limited form of quarantine, meant to keep them from catching any illness that might delay or endanger the mission. They saw their families only carefully and from a small distance. They moved through their days surrounded by doctors, engineers, and the gentle rhythm of final checks. On the coast of Florida, at what was then called the Kennedy Space Center, the Saturn V had already been moved from its enormous assembly building to Launch Complex 39A, a journey of 3.5 miles carried out by a massive crawler transporter moving at less than 1 mile per hour. The rocket now stood at the pad, white and slender against the sky, waiting. In the days before launch, hundreds of thousands of people began to gather along the nearby beaches and roadsides. They came in cars and campers with picnic blankets and small radios. Some had traveled across the country. Some had come from other continents. Around the world, the launch would be carried on television and radio in dozens of languages. It was estimated that more than 500 million people would eventually watch some part of the mission. For a brief time, much of humanity was turning its attention to a single piece of sky. On the morning of the 16th of July, the astronauts woke early. They ate a breakfast that had become traditional for launch days: steak and eggs. They were helped into their bulky white spacesuits, layer by layer, by the technicians who knew each seal and connector. They walked, helmets in hand, to the transfer van that would carry them to the pad. At the launch tower, they rode an elevator up the side of the rocket, more than 30 stories above the ground, and stepped one at a time across a small walkway into the command module. They settled into their couches, Armstrong on the left, Collins in the middle, Aldrin on the right. The hatch was closed and sealed behind them. Below them, in the great body of the Saturn V, more than 5.5 million pounds of fuel waited in carefully chilled tanks. Around them, 10,000 checks were being run by engineers in the control rooms. In Houston, a separate team at Mission Control had taken over operational responsibility from Florida. The countdown was now measured in minutes. A strange calm settles into a crew at this point. There is nothing more to learn. Every system has been checked. The decision is made. They lie on their backs, looking up at the gray panels of the spacecraft, and listen to the small voices in their headsets, counting down toward something the world has never quite done before. Outside the rocket, the morning grew bright over the Atlantic. The clock approached 0. At 9:32 in the morning, Eastern Time, on the 16th of July, 1969, the 5 F-1 engines at the base of the Saturn V ignited. They did not fire all at once, but came up to power in a careful sequence, building thrust over several seconds while the rocket was still held to the pad by enormous metal arms. The flames spread sideways across the deflector beneath the pad, and a great white cloud of steam billowed outward as cooling water poured over the structure. Inside the spacecraft, the astronauts felt the noise first, a low rolling thunder that rose into their bodies before they began to move. Then, at the moment of full thrust, the hold-down arms released, and the Saturn V lifted from the pad. It rose slowly at first, gathering speed as it climbed clear of the tower. From the ground it seemed almost majestic in its patience. Spectators miles away saw the bright flame and the slender white shape rising before the sound of it reached them several long seconds later as a deep, continuous roar that they felt in their chests. The rocket cleared the tower and began to roll gently onto its programmed flight path, heading east over the Atlantic. The acceleration grew. The crew was pressed back into their couches. Mission Control's calm voice marked each milestone: tower clear, roll program, pitch program. Everything was nominal. It was about 2.5 minutes into the flight, having lifted the rocket some 40 miles into the sky. The 5 F-1 engines of the first stage cut off. There was a sudden change of feeling, almost a lurch, as the great empty stage was released and fell away toward the ocean below. The second stage's 5 engines ignited and continued the climb. 6 minutes later, the second stage too dropped away, and the single engine of the third stage took over. 12 minutes after liftoff, Apollo 11 was in orbit around the Earth, traveling at more than 17,000 miles per hour, about 120 miles above the planet. The astronauts unstrapped themselves from their couches and floated for the first time in the gentle weightlessness that would now be their world for more than a week. They had a little less than 2 orbits in which to check every system before committing to the moon. When everything had been confirmed, the third stage was reignited for a burn lasting nearly 6 minutes. This was the translunar injection, the maneuver that lifted Apollo 11 out of Earth orbit and onto a path that would meet the moon. As the engine fired, the spacecraft's speed rose past 24,000 miles per hour, fast enough to escape the Earth's gravitational hold. When the engine shut down, the crew looked out the windows and saw the Earth slowly receding behind them. The moon was still nearly 4 days away. They were on their way. For the next 3 days, Apollo 11 coasted through the dark between worlds. After the violence of the launch, the spacecraft now moved in almost complete silence, carried only by the burn it had already made. There were no further engines firing for most of the journey. The craft simply fell forward through space along the curve that would meet the moon. Soon after the translunar injection, the crew performed one of the most delicate maneuvers of the early flight. The lunar module was still housed inside an adapter at the top of the spent third stage. Collins, as command module pilot, separated the command and service modules from the rest of the stack, turned them carefully around, and gently redocked nose to nose with the lunar module. Then the combined spacecraft pulled away, leaving the empty third stage to drift on its own path through space. From this point on, Eagle, the lunar module, and Columbia, the command module, would travel together as one craft. The cabin of Columbia was small. 3 men, 3 couches, instruments along the walls, food packages stored in compartments. Without gravity, items did not stay where they were placed unless held or fastened. A pen would float, a drop of water would drift slowly, and then break into smaller drops. The astronauts learned, as previous space travelers had, the strange small choreography of weightless life. To keep the spacecraft from being heated unevenly by the sun, mission controllers placed it in what was called the passive thermal control mode, sometimes nicknamed the barbecue roll. The craft turned slowly on its long axis, about 3 times an hour, so that no single side faced the sun for too long. From inside, the rotation was barely noticeable. From outside, the spacecraft turned like a small silver thing on a slow spit, glinting faintly against the stars. The astronauts ate, slept, monitored systems, and made small television broadcasts back to Earth. They showed viewers the inside of the cabin, the floating spoon of food, the slow rotation of the planet behind them. Earth grew smaller in the window with each passing hour. By the second day, it was a vivid blue and white sphere, small enough to be covered by an outstretched thumb. By the third day, it had become a little marble, beautiful and somehow tender, hanging alone in the dark. It is hard to convey how strange it must have been to look back at the entire planet from so far away. Everyone any of them had ever known was somewhere on that small marble. Every war, every birth, every breath of every life, all of it contained on a single fragile sphere. Several astronauts of those years would later say that this view, more than the moon itself, was what stayed with them most deeply. Apollo 11 coasted on, quiet and steady, drawing closer to a world none of them had yet seen with their own eyes. By the 4th day of the journey, the moon was no longer a distant idea. It had grown larger in the windows with each passing hour, until at last it filled most of the view. A great gray world close enough to show its craters and shadows in fine detail. The astronauts could see the rugged highlands, the dark, smooth plains called Maria, and the long ridges and ancient impacts that had shaped its surface across billions of years. After 3 days of looking at Earth shrinking behind them, it was a strange shift of attention. The destination had finally become real. Apollo 11 was now approaching the moon on a path that would carry it around the far side. The far side, often loosely called the dark side, is not actually darker than the near side. It receives sunlight just as the near side does. But because the moon turns on its axis at the same rate it orbits the Earth, the same hemisphere always faces us. The far side had been completely hidden from human eyes until Soviet probes photographed it for the first time in 1959. To pass behind the moon was to pass into a region beyond all radio contact with Earth. The most critical maneuver of the inbound journey took place there, out of sight and out of communication. It was called lunar orbit insertion. The spacecraft was traveling too quickly to be captured by the moon's gravity. If nothing slowed it, it would swing once around the far side and continue back toward Earth. To enter orbit, the service module engine had to fire for a precise duration, slowing the craft just enough to be caught by the moon's pull. The burn had to happen on the far side, in radio silence. There was no way for Mission Control in Houston to confirm the firing as it occurred, no way to help if something went wrong. The astronauts would simply disappear behind the moon, perform the burn alone, and reappear on the near side either in orbit or, if the burn had failed, on a path back toward Earth. The mission controllers calculated the exact moment when the spacecraft should emerge from behind the moon if everything had gone correctly. The crew approached the far side, performed their final checks, and prepared themselves. They lost radio contact with Earth exactly on schedule. For about 30 minutes, no one on the ground could hear them or speak to them. The engine fired for nearly 6 minutes. The astronauts watched their instruments, felt the gentle deceleration, and trusted that the long preparation had been enough. When Apollo 11 came back into view of the Earth slightly later than it would have without the burn, the controllers in Houston received the signal and exhaled. The spacecraft was in lunar orbit, circling about 60 miles above the surface. For the first time in the mission, the astronauts looked down on the moon as travelers, not as visitors yet, but no longer as observers from afar. Apollo 11 spent its first hours in lunar orbit in observation and preparation. The three men took turns at the windows, watching the gray surface slide past below them. They photographed the planned landing site in the southern part of the Sea of Tranquility, a relatively flat region chosen for its smoothness and the angle of sunlight that would fall on it during the descent. They checked and rechecked the systems of both spacecraft. They slept, or tried to, in the strange quiet of lunar orbit. On the morning of the 20th of July, the day of the landing, Armstrong and Aldrin began the slow process of moving from Columbia, the command module, into Eagle, the lunar module. They suited up, gathered their checklists, and floated through the small connecting tunnel between the two craft. Eagle was a strange-looking machine, four-legged and angular, designed for one purpose only. It would never need to fly through an atmosphere, never need to be aerodynamic. It could be all engineering and no elegance. Once inside, the two astronauts began their own series of checks. Eagle had its own systems, its own engine, its own small computer. Aldrin and Armstrong stood at their stations, harnessed by straps in the weightlessness, their helmets visible in the small triangular windows. Below them, the surface of the moon continued to pass. Then came the moment of separation. With a soft mechanical sound, the latches between Eagle and Columbia released. The two spacecraft drifted apart very slowly, only a few inches per second at first. Collins, alone now in Columbia, slowly pulled away to give Eagle room. He looked at the lunar module through his window as it receded, and he later described seeing the strange, spider-like craft with the two astronauts inside it, framed against the gray surface below. He spoke to them on the radio. He told them that Eagle looked beautiful, Armstrong, in his characteristic way, answered briefly. There were no speeches at this moment. The two craft were now flying independently, in slightly different orbits. Eagle was preparing for the descent. Columbia would continue in lunar orbit, waiting. A short maneuver lowered Eagle's orbit so that its lowest point came within about 50,000 feet of the lunar surface, roughly 9.5 miles. From there, the descent would begin in earnest. The two crews could still speak with each other and with Houston. They exchanged final checks, called out the readings on their instruments, and confirmed that all systems remained ready. Inside Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin watched the surface grow nearer. They had practiced this moment thousands of times in simulators. Now the moon itself, not a screen, not a photograph, was rising slowly into their windows. Eagle was about to begin the most carefully planned descent ever attempted by human beings. The powered descent began with a small, precise firing of Eagle's descent engine. At that moment, the lunar module was about 50,000 feet above the surface and traveling at more than 3,000 miles per hour relative to the ground below. The engine throttled up gently, then more strongly, slowing the craft and lowering its path. Armstrong stood at the left window, Aldrin at the right, both watching the gray surface roll past beneath them. For the first few minutes, the descent went almost exactly as planned. The astronauts called out altitudes and velocities. Mission Control in Houston monitored the data flowing back from Eagle. Charlie Duke, an astronaut serving as the capsule communicator that day, relayed the most important information between the controllers and the crew. His Carolina voice was steady and friendly. The room behind him was full of young engineers in their 20s and 30s, most of them at their consoles for the most important moments of their lives. Then a small alarm sounded inside Eagle. A code appeared on the computer display, 1202. Armstrong asked Houston what it meant. The crew did not recognize it. The descent was continuing, but the computer was telling them something. In the back room at Mission Control, a young engineer named Steve Bales had to decide within seconds whether to continue or to abort the landing. He understood, as the crew did not yet, that the alarm meant the computer was overloaded with tasks, but was handling its most important duties first. He gave the call. Go on that alarm. Charlie Duke passed the word up to Eagle. You are go for landing. The descent continued, then another alarm. 1201. Bales again said, go. Then the alarms stopped, and the surface kept rising. The astronauts could now see craters in detail, ridges, scattered boulders. They were perhaps a few thousand feet above the moon. As Eagle approached the planned landing zone, Armstrong realized that the computer was guiding them toward a field strewn with large rocks around the rim of a sizable crater. Landing there would be dangerous. Without saying much, he took semi-manual control of the descent, using a hand controller to steer the craft past the boulder field and onto a smoother area beyond. The fuel gauge began to drop into territory the crew had rarely seen in simulations. Houston's flight controllers watched their displays with growing concern. A young engineer called out fuel warnings. 60 seconds of fuel remaining. Then 30. There was a hard limit. If Eagle ran low enough that an abort could no longer be performed safely, the landing would have to be called off, and the ascent stage would have to fire immediately to lift the crew back toward Collins. But Armstrong was still flying, calm as he had ever been, looking for ground he could trust. Eagle was now descending slowly, almost hovering, while Armstrong steered it toward a flat area beyond the boulder field. The lunar module's engine kicked up a soft layer of dust as it approached the surface, dust that had not been disturbed for billions of years. The view from the windows changed. Where moments before there had been distant ground, there was now a textured surface close enough to study, gray and powdery, scarred with tiny craters and small rocks. Aldrin called out the descent data in a steady voice. Forward, drifting forward, down 2.5, 40 feet, down 2.5, picking up some dust, 30 feet. The numbers fell quietly between the two men, each one a measurement of altitude or rate. Inside Mission Control, almost no one moved. Charlie Duke held his microphone. Steve Bales watched his display. Many of the controllers held their breath. Then, beneath one of Eagle's legs, a small probe extending below the spacecraft touched the surface. A blue light flashed on the instrument panel inside the cabin. The contact light. Aldrin saw it first and called it out. Armstrong cut the engine. Eagle settled the last few feet onto the surface of the moon, slowly, with the gentleness of a small craft setting down on a beach. It was 4:18 in the afternoon, Houston time, on the 20th of July, 1969. The two astronauts looked at each other for a brief moment. Aldrin smiled. Armstrong reached up to flip a switch. Then Armstrong made the call that would be remembered for the rest of human history. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. In Mission Control, there was a brief moment of stillness, as if no one quite trusted their own ears. Then quiet applause broke out, then louder applause. Charlie Duke, his voice almost catching with emotion, replied to Eagle, "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." For the first time, human beings were on another world. Not above it, not orbiting it, on it. The lunar module rested in the Sea of Tranquility, a vast, smooth plain whose name came from astronomers of earlier centuries who had imagined seas where there were only ancient lava flows. Now those astronomers had been answered. There were no seas of water. There was only dust and rock and silence. Inside Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin were already running through their post-landing checklist. They had work to do before they could open the hatch and would not step outside for several more hours. Mission planners had scheduled a short sleep period before the moonwalk, but the astronauts asked to skip it. After the alarms and the manual flying and the final seconds of fuel, neither man could imagine resting now. They had arrived. Outside the small triangular windows, the gray surface stretched away under a black sky. Before stepping out, there was much to do. The two astronauts had to depressurize the cabin, prepare their portable life support systems, check the suits that would keep them alive in the vacuum outside. Aldrin took a quiet moment for himself, a small private communion that he had brought with him in a kit. He spoke a brief blessing into his microphone, asking listeners on Earth to pause and give thanks in their own way for what had been accomplished. Then the cabin pressure was vented to the lunar vacuum. The small hatch was opened. Armstrong, in his bulky white suit and life support backpack, moved slowly through the opening and onto the ladder. Mounted on one of Eagle's legs, a small television camera on the side of the lunar module had been positioned to capture his descent. Around the world, several 100 million people watched the ghostly black and white image of a man in a spacesuit moving carefully down a ladder onto another world. At the bottom of the ladder, Armstrong paused on the lunar module's footpad. He described what he saw. The surface appeared to be a fine powder. He could see his boot print clearly in the test area beside the ladder. Then he stepped off the footpad onto the surface of the moon itself. "That's one small step for man," he said, "one giant leap for mankind." For about 20 minutes, Armstrong was alone on the lunar surface. He moved around carefully, learning how the suit responded, how his own body adjusted to a gravity 1/6 that of Earth's. He collected a small contingency sample of lunar soil and rock and put it in a pocket of his suit, in case the mission had to be cut short and they had to leave quickly. He looked around at the strange landscape. The horizon was much closer than it would have been on Earth, because the moon is a smaller world. The sky was black, even though the sun was high. There were no stars visible to the eye in that brightness, only black above and gray below. Then Aldrin joined him. Climbing down the ladder, he paused at the footpad and described his first view of the surface. Magnificent desolation, he called it. Two words that would later become almost as famous as Armstrong's first ones. The two of them worked together for about 2.5 hours. They set up the American flag, stiffened with a rod so that it would appear to fly in the airless stillness. They received a brief call from President Nixon at the White House. They unveiled a plaque on one of Eagle's legs that read, "Here men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969. A.D. We came in peace for all mankind." They gathered samples of lunar rock and soil, more than 40 pounds in total, sealing them in containers. They deployed instruments designed to remain on the surface after they left. The work was steady and brief, limited by their backpacks. They had landed. They had walked. The footprints had been made. The Sea of Tranquility, where Eagle had settled, was not a sea in any familiar sense. The name had been given centuries earlier by astronomers who had looked at the moon through early telescopes and seen great dark patches that resembled bodies of water. They had called these regions Maria, the Latin word for seas. The name had stuck, even after later observation showed that there were no oceans on the moon at all. The dark plains were ancient lava flows, places where the lunar surface had once been molten and had then cooled into smooth, level ground. Armstrong and Aldrin moved across that ground carefully. The lunar gravity was about 1/6 of Earth's, so each step felt unusually light. They quickly learned that walking in the ordinary way did not work well. A gentle push against the surface would send them gliding forward, almost floating between steps. They developed a kind of low bouncing gait, partly a walk and partly a hop, that proved easier in the thin gravity. Their suits were stiff and pressurized, and bending was difficult, but they grew accustomed to the small adjustments needed. The lunar dust itself was strange. It was fine, almost like flour, and it clung to everything it touched. It darkened their boots and the lower parts of their suits. It carried a faint scent that they could only smell after returning to the cabin and removing their helmets. Several Apollo astronauts later described it as resembling spent gunpowder or wet ashes. No one was quite sure why. The dust had never been exposed to oxygen or water in any meaningful way, and it had been sitting in the vacuum of space for billions of years. Above them, the sky was completely black. The sun shone brightly enough to cast hard shadows, but with no atmosphere to scatter the light, the sky itself remained dark. There were no clouds, no horizon glow, no soft blue. The contrast between sunlit ground and shadowed rock was extreme. Where Armstrong stood, half of him was brilliantly lit, and the rest fell into deep shadow. Earth hung in the sky, a small blue and white sphere far away. It did not move quickly in their view. The moon turned slowly, and over the course of their brief stay, Earth shifted only a little in the black sky above them. Aldrin later wrote that he had felt no fear, only a strange awareness of being a long way from anything alive. They set up several scientific instruments. One was a seismometer, designed to measure any small tremors in the lunar surface, like a stethoscope listening for a heartbeat in a body long thought silent. Another was a special reflector, a small panel of mirrors aimed back at Earth. Astronomers there could fire laser beams at it and measure how long the light took to return. Even now, decades later, that reflector still answers when called. While Armstrong and Aldrin moved across the surface, the third astronaut waited alone in lunar orbit. Michael Collins in the command module Columbia circled the moon every 2 hours, sometimes in radio contact with both his crewmates and Houston, sometimes in radio contact with no one at all. Each time his orbit carried him behind the moon for about 48 minutes, he was cut off from all human voices. Some accounts have described him in those minutes as the loneliest human being in history. Collins himself gently disagreed. He later wrote that he had not felt lonely, only aware. He had a job to do. He had instruments to monitor and systems to manage. He knew that the success of the entire mission depended on his command module remaining in working order, so that Eagle would have a craft to return to. If anything happened to Columbia, his crewmates would be stranded on the surface with no way home. He took the responsibility seriously, and he found a strange kind of peace in it. When his orbit took him over the near side, he could speak to Houston. He passed over the Sea of Tranquility and tried to spot Eagle far below, though the lunar module was too small to be seen from his altitude. Mission Control sent him updates, and he sent his own observations back. He noted weather patterns on the receding Earth, watched the changing light on the lunar surface, made navigational checks. He drank coffee. He ate small meals from packages. He listened to music on a small cassette player he had brought along. When his orbit carried him behind the moon, silence fell. The moon blocked all radio signals from Earth and from Eagle alike. For those 48 minutes, Collins was completely on his own, with no one to speak to, no one to ask for help. He has been described as separated from the rest of humanity by a distance no one had ever been separated by before. There were 3 billion people on the Earth and 2 more on the lunar surface, and for a little while on each orbit, Collins was farther from any of them than any human being in history had ever been. He passed the time by working, observing, and occasionally writing brief notes in his flight log. He looked out the small windows at the lunar surface drifting beneath him, gray and silent. He looked at the black sky filled with stars he could not photograph well. He thought about what his crewmates were doing far below, somewhere on the dust of tranquility. He waited. Each time he came back into communication, he heard the voices of Houston and Eagle and felt the quiet companionship of the human world resume. Each time he passed behind the moon again, that companionship paused. His role would not be remembered the way Armstrong's first step would be, but without him there would have been no return. After about 2.5 hours on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin gathered their samples, their instruments' final readings, and climbed back into Eagle. They sealed the hatch and repressurized the cabin. They removed their helmets and gloves. For the first time, they could smell the lunar dust clinging to their suits, that faint scent of something burned, something ancient. They had a few hours of rest scheduled before the ascent. Aldrin tried to sleep on the cabin floor, curled up between the instruments. Armstrong rested in a sling stretched above him. Neither slept well. It was cold inside the lunar module, and the cabin was small, and the knowledge of where they were would not let either of them fully relax. Then it was time. The ascent stage of Eagle was a separate craft mounted on top of the descent stage with its own small engine. The descent stage, with its 4 legs, would remain on the lunar surface forever, becoming part of the moon. The ascent stage would lift the 2 astronauts back into orbit. There was only one engine for the ascent. If it failed, there was no second chance. They would not be able to leave. Armstrong and Aldrin completed their pre-launch checks. They armed the engine. At the appointed moment, the engine ignited. The ascent stage rose smoothly from the descent stage, leaving the legs and the lower body of Eagle behind on the surface. From the small windows, the astronauts watched the gold foil of the descent stage falling away beneath them, growing smaller as they rose. The American flag and the experiments they had set up remained on the gray ground. The ascent engine burned for about 7 minutes, lifting Eagle into a low lunar orbit. From there, Careful maneuvers brought the two craft together. After nearly 4 hours of navigation, Eagle rendezvoused with Columbia. The two spacecraft docked gently in lunar orbit, and the connecting tunnel between them was opened. Collins later described the moment when his crewmates floated back into the command module as one of the happiest of his life. He had been alone in lunar orbit for nearly 24 hours. Now Armstrong and Aldrin were back, dusty and tired and quietly elated. The three men were together again. Eagle's ascent stage was released and left in lunar orbit. The crew of Columbia performed a final engine burn that lifted the spacecraft out of lunar orbit and onto a path back toward Earth. The moon began to recede in the windows. Earth, small but growing, lay ahead. The journey home would take another 3 days. The mission was not yet over, and a re-entry through Earth's atmosphere still lay between them and the ocean below. But the most uncertain part was now behind them. They were no longer at the moon. They were going home, drawn back toward the small blue world growing in the windows ahead. The voyage home was quieter than the voyage out. The astronauts performed their navigation checks, ate their meals, made small television broadcasts to viewers on Earth, and watched the planet grow larger in the windows each day. The world ahead of them was already changed. They could not yet know how much, but they could sense it from the messages coming up from Houston. Crowds were gathering. Newspapers were being prepared. Their faces in those grainy lunar photographs were already familiar to hundreds of millions of people. On the 24th of July, 1969, Apollo 11 approached Earth at high speed. The service module, which had carried them all the way to the moon and back, was released, leaving only the small command module to make re-entry. The capsule oriented itself for the descent, its blunt heat shield facing the atmosphere, and entered at nearly 25,000 miles per hour. For a few minutes, the friction of re-entry surrounded the capsule with a fireball. Temperatures outside the heat shield reached several thousand degrees. Communication with the ground was cut off by the ionized gases of re-entry. Then the capsule emerged into denser air. The parachutes deployed in sequence, and Columbia descended gently toward the Pacific Ocean. The splashdown was about 13 miles from the recovery ship, the USS Hornet. Helicopters were already in the air. Within minutes, Navy divers in protective suits reached the floating capsule, attached flotation collars, and helped the three astronauts emerge. The astronauts themselves wore biological isolation garments, because no one was certain whether they might have brought back any unknown lunar microorganisms. The crew was lifted by helicopter to the Hornet, where they walked into a sealed quarantine trailer that would be their home for the next 3 weeks. President Nixon was aboard the Hornet to greet them. He spoke to them through the trailer window, smiling broadly. The world celebrated. Parades were planned. Stamps were printed. The lunar samples were carefully moved to laboratories for study. The astronauts themselves remained in quarantine, watching it all from a distance through television. When the quarantine ended in August, the three men began an exhausting world tour. They visited dozens of countries, met heads of state, addressed huge crowds. Aldrin found the tour particularly difficult. He struggled in the years that followed with depression and with the question of what one does after walking on the moon at 39. Armstrong became quieter than he had been before, retreating from public life as much as he could. Collins wrote a thoughtful memoir, Carrying the Fire, considered one of the finest books by any astronaut. The three men had returned. They had done what no one had done before, and each of them, in his own way, would carry that journey for the rest of his life. In the years that followed Apollo 11, 5 more crewed missions reached the lunar surface. Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 each carried 2 astronauts down to different landing sites. They brought back hundreds of pounds of lunar rock. They drove small electric vehicles across the surface. They left more instruments behind, more flags, more footprints. The last of those missions, Apollo 17, returned to Earth in December of 1972. No human being has walked on the moon since. There are reasons for that. The cost of the program had been enormous. The political urgency that had driven it, the Cold War rivalry, had eased. New priorities took the place of old ones. The space agencies of the world turned their attention to other goals, to space stations, to robotic missions across the solar system, to telescopes that could see almost to the beginning of the universe. The moon remained where it had always been, patient and gray, with the small artifacts of human visits still scattered across a few of its plains. The footprints are still there. The lunar surface has no wind, no rain, no flowing water. The only forces that act on those prints are the slow rain of micrometeorites, tiny grains striking the surface over millions of years, and the changes of temperature between lunar day and lunar night. The prints will erode eventually, but on a time scale that has barely begun. For all practical purposes, they will remain for millions of years to come. What Apollo 11 gave us was more than a footprint. It was a new way of seeing ourselves. The photograph of the Earth, taken from lunar orbit, a small blue and white sphere against the black, became one of the most famous images ever taken. It changed how many people thought about the planet. The borders that loomed so large on maps simply did not exist when seen from that distance. There were only oceans and continents and clouds, and beneath them, a single shared home. The astronauts themselves often spoke of that view, more than the moon as the thing that stayed with them. From far away, the earth looked fragile and beautiful and unified. They had gone to another world only to find that what they had really seen, perhaps for the first time, was their own. The moon is still above us tonight. Somewhere, depending on its phase and the hour, it is rising or setting or crossing the dark. The footprints are still there, waiting. The flag, bleached by sunlight, still stands. The reflector still answers when called. The world slows, and so do we. Let the moon keep its quiet distance. Let the planet turn beneath you as it always has. Let your breathing soften. There is nothing more to do tonight. The long voyage of Apollo 11 has been told, and the moon, as always, watches over the slow turning of our small and beautiful home. Good night.